This is Gary Lux, and you're listening to The Business Side of Music.
Success in the music business begins with a dream, a vision. This podcast will give you, the listener, the insight and tools to turn that vision into a reality. Meet the industry professionals who work day by day behind the scenes, helping to make those dreams come true. Welcome to The Business Side of Music.
This is Bob Bender. You're listening to this edition of The Business Side of Music. In the studio today, we have Andy Hill. I had the opportunity to meet him a few weeks back. We both spoke on a panel, Southern Women in Film Conference in Nashville, Tennessee. We got to chat with each other. It turns out after the fact that we know a couple of the same people, Gary Lux, who we've had on the show. Andy is quite the composer, but more importantly, really seems to have his finger on the pulse in the business. He studied film at NYU. He's former vice president of music production at Walt Disney Pictures, former program director for music composition for the screen, Columbia College, Chicago, is the composer and producer of his company, Cinemuse, and has written a book called Scoring the Screen. Andy, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Bob. It's good to be here. And I try to keep my finger on the pulse. Thank you for saying that. It's difficult sometimes to find the pulse, but it is there.
Yeah, and we're in an ever-changing business. We have had experts on the show in the past dealing with film, television, music. What we're finding is it's an ever-changing thing. And my wife and I have both produced television shows that were music-based, music incorporated, getting involved with all of the sync licensing and the legalese that we have to deal with to make these events happen. There's a lot more to getting music on the film than just getting music in the film, isn't there?
Absolutely. I mean, people talk about placements as if they were a bit like product placements or something, as if you could just walk into a cutting room with any, hot sounding tune and plug it into the film. That you, as a music supervisor, for example, since that's what I've spent a lot of my life doing, that music supervisors simply have that power, and they don't, of course. It's filmmakers, television producers, creative people of all times agonize over the right music choice. So when a band, a new artist, particularly if it's somebody a little idiosyncratic, unusual, alternative, actually does get prominent placement in a film or a television show, it's a big deal. Even if not much money changes hands, which it probably doesn't. So, yeah, there's all the usual choices come into play. I mean, if the tune is coming off a car radio or somebody's earbuds or in a diner, obviously it has to obey the same rules that everything else in the film does, which is don't get in the way of the story.
It's almost, and I've said this before too, the music to me is a little bit of accent or seasoning to the actual scene that you're watching. Now, and I've said this, turn the volume down, turn up the closed captioning, or turn on the closed captioning without the music there, and it's a whole different flavor with the music being there. And I think that's where it's so important, especially for the role of a music supervisor, which I want to get into here, placing that right piece of music in that certain segment of the film. And it might be 5 seconds, it might be a couple minutes, it might be a score, but it's important that the right piece of music falls into that certain place.
Well, absolutely. I think that first of all, the only reason you and I are still working in this business is because everybody who makes films recognizes that is true, what you just said. If you're in an Italian restaurant in Little Italy, in the 70s or something like that, and the right tune is on the jukebox, the location comes alive sensually in a way that it couldn't otherwise. I mean, you start to smell the garlic, and so it can be an art. A lot of times we get stuck on the business side of it because everybody's always trying to figure out, how do I get in,
Right.
And once I'm in, how do I ensure repeat customers? And the marketing aspects of it. But at the heart of it is this this selection process about what belongs in there and what doesn't. And then, as you know, there's a whole, once that choice is made, you begin a new phase, which is trying to figure out how much you ought to pay for it, how broad your license ought to be, all that kind of stuff, whether it's going to be on a soundtrack. And this is now all, as you say, nothing is constant but change in the music business. And now this is all being done under new business models that didn't exist 20, 25 years ago.
And you brought up something that I think is important to realize too. If you are a songwriter or you're a composer of music for film or television or stage for that matter, and the soundtrack is being released, there's still no guarantee that your music's going to wind up on the soundtrack. I worked on a couple film projects in the past, Quest for Camelot and this Sylvester Stallone movie Driven, where we worked with the music supervisors, got the music placed onto the film, and our goal was always to try and either get the theme song. We worked with Leanne Rimes on How Do I Live for the movie Con Air. That wound up not being used because Trisha Yearwood wound up singing the part. We still want to get our music placed on that soundtrack. And typically, and our ultimate goal from that end of things is to be the hit off that soundtrack. And so the music supervisor, what specifically is their role?
Well, the title goes back actually to the early days of Hollywood, when the music supervisor functions almost more like a musical director in live theater. It's an old-fashioned producer job, which involves elements of stage management, budgeting, hiring necessary ancillary personnel, sometimes hiring musicians, making sure everybody gets paid, that sort of thing. As it transferred to Hollywood, because there were all these new technical demands involved in using music in film, music supervisors had to become sophisticated about that stuff as well. And the job started to become much more about the selection, acquisition of existing material than it was about producing new material or about actually supervising live recordings. So if you're a filmmaker and you've got a favorite music supervisor, somebody you've worked with a couple of times and you trust, you're going to call them sometimes fairly early in the game, certainly as soon as you begin cutting the film, and ask them to start supplying you. You give them a script and a breakdown of what you need, what function the music has to have in the scene, all of that, the length, rough, timing, things like that. And then the music supervisor goes and tracks any number of things down and presents them as options to the filmmakers. And these people are notoriously indecisive. Mm-hmm. And for good reason. There's a lot of money on the line. And nobody wants to come out of this looking bad, choosing the wrong song. So they will do 3, 4, 5, 6 or more things in there. You may go to a preview where your song is absolutely killing the movie. It's just working perfectly. And then the next thing you know, it's out. Because it just has to ultimately, I guess it varies. If it's motion pictures, it's usually the director. If it's television, the showrunner. Games, the sound designer. But it's the same process, almost no matter what. And yeah, your place is never assured in the film until it's actually been released.
So when we come back, I want to talk a little bit about how a songwriter or a composer can get their music, how they go about the movement of getting discovered, getting their music placed into a project. This is Bob Bender, and you're listening to this edition of The Business Side of Music.
You're listening to The Business Side of Music.
Hi, this is Vinny Rebus, the founder of Indie Connect. Our goal is to ensure that you have the knowledge, the tools, skills, resources, and connections that you need to develop a profitable and long-lasting career in music. One way we do this is through these Business Side of Music podcasts. I'd also like to invite you to check out Indie Connect magazine, our free multimedia online publication packed with practical interviews and advice from music industry experts. Go to www.indieconnectmag. That's www.indieconnectmag.com. Let us walk with you and guide you every step of your musical journey.
You're listening to the business side of music.
This is Bob Bender. You're listening to this edition of the Business Side of Music. In the studio today, Andy Hill with Cinemuse, a music composer, author of the book Scoring the Screen, former program director at Graduate Film Scoring at Berkeley, Valencia. We didn't mention that earlier, along with former program director of music composition for the screen at Columbia College in Chicago and Walt Disney Pictures. Andy, where we left off was, how does a aspiring song composer, songwriter, someone who thinks they have what it takes to get their music into film, television, gaming, what's the protocol these days?
Well, as Bob, as was suggested by the resume that you read off, the credits that you read off, my focus in this business really for the past dozen years has been more toward the composition of original music, what's generally known as score, sometimes called underscore, the instrumental music that supports the movie emotionally and thematically, the music that wins the Oscar for Best Original Score, right? That's been my focus, and that's the subject of the book, Scoring the Screen, which Hal Leonard published last year and will be out as an ebook later this year. I'm going to maybe show a little bit of bias toward those composers of instrumental music, but I want to actually start out by saying that I think the most exciting new ground in music for film lies in collaborations between songwriters and composers. A good example, Win Butler from Arcade Fire was nominated for an Oscar and a Golden Globe for co-scoring Her, the Spike Jonze movie from a few years back. Mm-hmm. And I'm embarrassed to say that the name of his collaborator has slipped my mind. All your listeners will be busily, going to IMDb and figuring this out faster than my brain can work, probably. But anyhow, they were two, Spike Jonze, Her, composers Win Butler and of Arcade Fire. Anyhow, the point of the story is that Win is a songwriter, a really good one, but he had never composed a dramatic score for a film before, and the score has to do all sorts of things that a song doesn't do. It has to wrap around the drama. It has to wrap around the characters. It has to weave its way in and out of scenes. In a way, a song just lays over the top of it, basically, and it either works or it doesn't. But score is a different thing. So he had a frequent collaborator of the band's, a violin player, work with him and create the orchestrations that were used in recording the score. So Win would come up with the ideas, presumably, pitch them to his partner, who would then do whatever, put them pencil to pencil on paper, or likely in a computer notation program, would create arrangements for them to record. The same thing is true of Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross, who of course won an Oscar for The Social Network. Again, Trent's a songwriter. He's an idea person. Yes, he can sit down at the piano and compose a sequence of chords that really works great. But again, it's a whole different thing to place that music in a film in a way that doesn't step on dialogue or intrude on the suspense of the scene or whatever. Those are specialized skills. So he worked with a guy named Atticus Ross, who has orchestral training. This is exciting stuff. When you get somebody like a T-Bone Burnett, for example, his music has been featured in a number of films so far because he has this really distinctive If you get that guy paired up with the right score composer, somebody who really understands how movies work, you could have an incredible score. Like the kind of scores that Ry Cooder used to do, you know? You know what I'm talking about.
And Ry, to me, is one of the most proficient, amazing writers out there of all time. Yeah.
Right. So in other words, what I'm saying is I don't think that songwriters, if they love the movies and they have a feel for story and for so forth, they shouldn't be afraid at all to team up with their artsy, conservatory trained, cello playing friend, and do this. And if you think about it, some of the major stories of the last few years have been composers who did these kind of collaborations. There's a group called Explosions in the Sky down in Texas that works a lot with David Wingo, who's a film composer. This stuff is happening everywhere, and I think it's exciting. Now, so all of this is to answer your question by saying the first thing I would say to someone who aspires to have song material in film is to hook up with people who know film, such as film composers. Even if that's somebody who has just done some episodic music for a single TV program or something like that.
Right.
Those people have connections, whether they be agents, managers, etc. And if you've got great material and you know how to deliver it, something might come of that. Also, direct approach to the filmmakers. We'll talk about music supervisors in a second, because everybody assumes it has to be music supervisors, that's the entry point, right? But don't forget about that every town, every city of any size in the country right now has an independent filmmakers association of some kind. You can find them obviously in Chicago, LA, New York, Philadelphia, Atlanta, but they're in other places too. That's how something like Slam Dance came about, or South by Southwest.
It's how you and I met.
Yeah,
we were at a film conference in Nashville.
That's right. And the filmmakers, they're ultimately your customers. The music supervisor is simply a way to get to them. Music supervisors today run the gamut, and I say this as one of them, so I say it without meaning it disparagingly, but they run the gamut from being, superbly knowledgeable, sort of walking encyclopedias of music, every genre of music, pop, jazz, folk, funk, hip hop, classical, what have you, who just have this incredible sense of what will work, all the way down to people who are simply brokers, because they've got a half a dozen or a dozen indie bands who they're interested in and they think they can place. And those indie bands maybe have signed up some sort of deal with them. Maybe there's some unspoken or unwritten agreements between them. But the music supervisor's job is basically to be a mediator between the film production and the talent they need. And oftentimes these days, because they're working on very low budgets, they can't afford the band they'd really like to have. So the music supervisor becomes a conduit to getting the same kind of track, the same kind of sound from a much less expensive artist. And
that's something we talked about a little bit on the panel at the conference too, that right. If you want Sublime or you want whoever and you can't get them, you want your next best effort is to go out and find someone that is similar to them.
That's right. And it's tremendously time consuming for a production assistant or a producer's assistant or something like that to do that research, even though we have Google and we have Last.fm and we have Spotify and we have these different services. Just think of the time, if you don't already know your stuff, that it would take for you to find indie bands that are available and that have material that has been mastered and is ready to go in your film for the right price. So instead you call, who you're going to call. You call your friendly neighborhood music supervisor, because hopefully they can get you to this stuff faster. Now, hopefully what happens as music supervisors grow in their roles is they also become that other thing, which is somebody who just knows the stuff cold and can even go into a studio if necessary and produce a track.
Let's take a little bit of a break, get a word in here for one of our sponsors. And when we come back, I want to pick your brain on what advice you would give someone who is just starting to get into this business. This is Bob Bender. We're in the studio with Andy Hill, and you're listening to this edition of The Business Side of Music.
You're listening to The Business Side of Music. Next up, the Indie Artist Spotlight, brought to you by Reverb Nation.
Hi, my name is Holly Horton, and I'm a member of Reverb Nation.
Spent many a days on McFrancis Road, where I once was alone, till you came along.
I'm based out of Birmingham, Alabama.
We first met in a yellow chateau, where we learned to grow, where we would roam. Now here I stay, you're at least a day's drive away.
I've played at just about every exit from the Gulf Coast northbound to Nashville.
The time came when winter would unfold, many nights that were cold, it seemed to never snow. You would laugh with me and I laugh with you, like good friends do. We were such a
My music is a mix between Americana, folk, and country.
Summer came, we had to bid adieu. You left and I never felt with more blue. Here I stay and you're at least a day's drive away.
Some of the artists I love listening to and have influenced me include Stevie Nicks, John Paul White, Jewel, and Emmylou Harris.
Take me back to that place where across the aisle to see a smiling face. Those are the moments we can't replace. Those are the moments that I embrace. Now here I stay, and you're at least a day's drive away.
This is a song that I wrote and had the amazing opportunity to record up in Nashville, and it's called Alabama Woman.
Alabama born and raised I am. Grew up down in Birmingham. He was just mama, daddy, and me. We were happy as we could be. Now I'm an Alabama woman, I'm tough as I could be. Don't you mess with me. Alabama, where the skies are so blue. Lord, I'm coming home to you. You'll get attached just like glue. Ain't no way you're forgetting this you. I'm an Alabama woman, I'm tough as I could be. Don't you mess with me. plenty and God's grace, I'm fine.
You can visit my website, and that's holly.org. That's HOLLYE. You can find all my social media links on there, as well as listen to some of my music.
I'm an Alabama woman. I'm tough as I could be. I'm an Alabama woman. Don't you mess with me. I'm an Alabama woman. I'm tough as I could be. Don't you mess with me. I'm an Alabama woman. Don't you mess with me. I'm an Alabama woman. Don't you mess with me.
Once again, this is Holly Horton, and I'm a proud member of Reverb Nation.
You're listening to the business side of music.
This is Bob Bender. We're in the studio with Andy Hill. You're listening to this edition of the business side of music. Andy is, as a film composer who's been doing this for quite a few years and has quite a bit of credit to your name. I'm a young college kid, and I'm just wanting to get started. I'm fresh out of a music program, or maybe I'm getting ready to go into a music business program. What should I do? What should I anticipate in looking for to get my foot in a door? Is there any special studies, any special classes? There's no short way to do this. There's not an abbreviated instruction. But what is it that a young, aspiring composer needs to look to do?
And you're speaking, Bob, both of people who are songwriters or singer-songwriters or songwriter-arrangers.
Correct.
And people who aspire to be the next Hans Zimmer.
Yeah,
right?
or a T-Bone Burnett or whoever.
Right, okay. Well, let's talk about the hybrid model, because actually I think that's the most vital place right now. Let's talk about people who are straddling both worlds. I mentioned this guy, David Wingo. Austin, Texas has kind of a scene right now, obviously, but even for film and for film music, it's a growing place. I wish Nashville were as keen on that as Austin has been, because I think exciting things could happen here. But Austin's produced a couple of interesting composers, and one of them is David Wingo. Another one is Daniel Hall, who scored the Rooney Mara, Casey Affleck, A Ghost Story last year. So these are people who have lived in both worlds. They're perfectly capable of writing really great songs that will stand up to anything that Sufjan Stevens, has written. Mm-hmm. But they also have this gift for integrating music into film. I'm excited about those composers, so I'm going to speak to them for a second, because the others, either pure songwriters who are just looking to place their music, or pure composers who are looking to get gigs writing a 40-minute score, those are kind of special extremes. Now, what they all have in common, middle, left, and right, is what we talked about before, which is getting to the filmmakers wherever they go. If you could afford to get on a plane and book a room in Park City and go to the Sundance Festival and go to every, event at the BMI Coffee House, or is it ASCAP that does that again? I think it's BMI, and rub shoulders with every filmmaker, you can. If you have the time to scan the trade magazine, Hollywood Reporter every week publishes films and television projects in pre-production, production, and post-production. If you're a music person who wants to get music into a film, and ultimately you want to work for that director, you want to work for that film, you have to know who to contact. Listings like that give you the beginning, at least there's an email address. I can't tell you how many times I've written blind letters to generic email addresses listed in the Hollywood Reporter. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I got meetings from them, and sometimes I got jobs. It's a crapshoot, but you have to know what's out there. And you know what? As you're going down those lists, and I speak of the Hollywood Reporter, but they also do this in Daily Variety. As you're going down that, you may see a name. You may see, oh man, I know who that guy is. He directed a music video that a friend of mine, an artist friend of mine, did with him. or maybe I, was one of the musicians in a music video that this guy directed. So anyhow, you make that sort of connection, then you've got a hook, you've got an angle when you contact these people. I know that sounds obvious, but it can't be said enough.
You're right. It's sometimes the simplest thing. It's sometimes the easiest move to get your foot in that door. A friend of mine years ago, a songwriter out of Virginia, was going through a list of songs for an artist that we had in the studio. And the one song was not going to work for the artist in the studio. We knew that. It was just the story wasn't correct. It was a totally different angle. But he played the song for us, and we wound up having someone who was looking for music for a particular film. And I said, wait a minute, I think I've got the song for you. And I played it, and it was done deal. I mean, and it was just because the songwriter said, well, here, let me play this song. I don't think it's going to work for your artist, but let me play it anyway. But it wound up getting placed into a film.
Absolutely. And listen, the old stuff never goes away. Bruce Springsteen walking into John Hammond's office at CBS at Columbia in New York with his beat-up acoustic guitar and sitting down in the office and playing 3 songs is still, certainly here in Nashville, and I would guess in Austin, many other places too. If you can find an opportunity to do that at the right place at the right time, and as I say, a coffee house atmosphere at a film festival is a perfect place to do that.
It is, yes.
And that means so much more than any elevator pitch you can come up with, because it's about the music. There are other ways. One of the ways to make good use of something like YouTube, which by and large I don't have much time for. I mean, I don't like the business model, and I don't like overall how it's devalued the services of musicians. But one good way to make use of it is to create your own little noir film. Like you mentioned, T-Bone Burnett wrote a great main title for True Detective. So you create your own collage of still images of like dark streets and dark alleys and dames and fast cars and so forth or whatever. And then you put your music to it. And it becomes a project. It becomes both an audio and a visual thing that people can enjoy. Mm-hmm. And if you're lucky, it goes at least semi-viral. You also mentioned Reverb Nation. I have to confess, I need to get fully up to speed on what they're all doing. But I do understand that they are serving the function that talent agents used to serve, as well as to some extent the function that publishers used to serve, in the sense that they're creating these consortiums of artists and then, pushing their music out there. Now, CD Baby and so forth, that's different. They're an aggregator. But Reverb Nation, if I understand it, is actually doing something active with the music, right?
It is. It's somewhere where you can go, you can type in an artist's name and be able to listen to 2, 3, 4, 5 of their songs. They're readily available.
Right. So it's a place where obviously a music supervisor might send a director there to listen, to check out a given artist, which is the other thing. I know we're running out of time, but it should be mentioned. A lot of young composers these days, straight out of school, straight on the streets in LA and Nashville and New York, wherever, the very first thought is they need to write for a library, because the libraries obviously have become a source in this era of lower budgets and speed, a very efficient way for filmmakers, particularly in television, to get a hold of the music they need to satisfy something in their project. And so the libraries have now tailored themselves, whereas they were almost like stock footage libraries. They just had archival stuff. Mm-hmm. Now, as you know, libraries, people write for libraries. They write entire catalogs of suspense, of thriller, of romance, of romantic comedy, and so forth, as well as songs. And of course, the fear for somebody like me who loves working with artists in the studio, or at least creating an original product, is that these libraries might take over. They just become one-stop shops. But it may be the way of the future. And actually, how different is that from being signed to, I'm trying to think, Warner Chappell or someone like that back in 1961 and writing exclusively for that publishing company. I guess this could end up being like that.
I remember back in the mid 80s, I subscribed to Killer Tracks out of Los Angeles, and they sent me their library. They sent me a catalog of, 40, 50 CDs, and, one set would be fantasy music, 1, 2, 3.
Right.
One would be stingers or news broadcasts, 1, 2, 3. And you would listen to those to choose what it was you needed for whatever type of TV spot or show or film that you were working on. So I don't think that recipe has necessarily changed. I think what has expanded is the number of artists out there now who, as you said, sit down and specifically write suspenseful or adventurous or whatever it is that the style of the music director or supervisor is looking for.
Exactly. It's gotten a lot more dialed in and specific. Killer Tracks was servicing mostly an advertising clientele, as you know, and their music, and they were the leaders of the pack for quite a long time in that arena. But, their music, Michael Mann would not have chosen a Killer Tracks cut for Heat or any one of his classic films. The music has to be a lot more bespoke, tailor-made, and that's what's happening with some of these new libraries. Is they've actually got writers under contract who, for all intents and purposes, can create a score. It won't be as good as something that James Newton Howard would write, to picture.
Mm-hmm.
But for a lot of television, television in Europe is almost entirely tracked from libraries. So it's something to look at, certainly something for any songwriter, composer to be aware of, is that getting his or her stuff placed in a library that is actively licensing to filmmakers, that actually has credits on current running television shows or current, indie theatrical shows or something like that. That's a place you have to look.
You're right. Check the credits on a show or a film. Find out, and you'll see a lot of repeat names. Those are the people that are really stirring the pot.
Absolutely.
Andy, thanks so much for being on the show.
All right, Bob. It was a pleasure.
Same here. If you're interested in learning more about our show, drop us a line at musicpodcast@mail.com. That's musicpodcast@mail.com. If you have any suggestions of persons or topics that involve some facet of the music industry that you'd like to hear about on our podcast, please feel free to let us know. You can follow us on Facebook on the Business Side of Music podcast page. You can also find us on Twitter at Music Business Podcast. Also, if you're listening to this podcast on iTunes, post a review on what you think of our show. This is Bob Bender, and you've been listening to this edition of The Business Side of Music.
The Business Side of Music is the creation of Tom Sabella and Tracy Snow and is produced by Bob Bender for Bob Bender Productions. Co-producer for the show is Vinny Rivas. The Business Side of Music is recorded at Music Dog Studios in Los Angeles, California and Nashville, Tennessee. Production sound design by Keith Stark. Voiceover and promo by Lisa Fuson.